I remember the exact temperature of the room when the screen refreshed, a chilling 68 degrees that suddenly felt like absolute zero. I was sitting in my home office, a cup of lukewarm tea in my hand, ready to pay the final installment for my sister's specialized medical recovery fund. This was the culmination of 3 years of disciplined saving, a safety net designed to give her back the ability to walk after her accident. $82,376. That was the specific number etched into my brain, the result of every bonus, every side hustle, and every penny pinched. But as the loading circle vanished, the digits that replaced my hope made my stomach drop into a dark abyss. The screen read $14.22. I didn't scream. I couldn't even breathe. I refreshed the page once, then twice, then 5 times until my vision blurred. The joint savings account, the one Julian and I had built over 8 years of grueling corporate work and shared dreams, was a hollow shell. Every cent of our future had been sucked out in a single, massive wire transfer. The transaction memo was short, cryptic, and devastating. Project Alpha. My heart wasn't just beating, it was slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. When Julian walked through the door that evening at 6 o'clock, he wasn't acting like a man who had just dismantled his wife's security. He was whistling a low, Johnny tune I didn't recognize. He dropped his keys on the marble counter with a sharp clink and leaned over to kiss my cheek, but I flinched away before his lips could touch my skin. He smelled of ozone, expensive coffee, and something metallic, like a machine shop. "Julian, where's the money?" I asked, my voice coming out as a jagged ghost of itself. He didn't blink or stutter. He just smiled, that smooth, Ivy League smile that used to make me feel safe, but now felt like a predatory mask. "It's work, Elena. It's an investment in us. A secret project that is going to change our entire lives forever. You just have to trust me for once." I gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. "Trust you? You emptied my sister's surgery fund for a secret? That wasn't your money to take, Julian. That was her life." He didn't apologize. He just tightened his jaw and walked toward his study, leaving a trail of cold air behind him. For the next week, Julian became a complete stranger living inside a familiar body. He stopped eating dinner with me, claiming he was too busy with logistics, and he stopped looking me in the eye entirely. Every time I brought up the missing $82,000, he would sigh with a heavy, performative weariness, as if I were a nagging, simplistic child who couldn't possibly grasp the complexities of high-level finance. "You have no vision, Elena," he told me one rainy Tuesday night, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of his encrypted laptop. "I'm building a legacy here. Something that will make people remember our name long after we are gone. If you can't handle the pressure of the climb, maybe you shouldn't be at the top with me when we finally arrive." That was the moment our marriage truly cracked down the center. It wasn't just theft of the money anymore, it was the chilling condescension. I realized he wasn't looking at me as a partner, but as an obstacle to his ego. He had decided that his secret was worth more than my sister's ability to walk, and he expected me to be grateful for the betrayal. Julian's behavior shifted from secretive to obsessive as the second week began. He started disappearing from the house before the sun rose, often leaving by 5 in the morning and not returning until well after midnight. When he finally did crawl into bed, he didn't smell like another woman's perfume, which was a betrayal I almost wished for because I knew how to handle an affair. Instead, he smelled of industrial grease, salt air, and burnt wiring. He began locking his home office with a newly installed keypad, and I would hear him through the vents, pacing and speaking in a tone I'd never heard before, urgent, desperate, and fiercely possessive. On Thursday night, I stood outside the door and heard him mention a name. Vera. He said her name with a reverence that chilled me to the bone. "Vera, the seals have to hold," he whispered into the phone. "I've put everything into this. There's no turning back now. Elena is starting to ask too many questions, but she won't find us at the pier." I retreated to the kitchen, my mind racing. Who was Vera? And why were they meeting at a pier in the dead of night? I did something I'm not proud of on Friday night, driven by a cocktail of terror and desperate curiosity. I waited for Julian to fall into a heavy, snoring, exhausted sleep, the kind of sleep that only comes to men who believe they are invincible. His phone flashed with a notification on the bedside table. I held my breath, sliding it toward me with trembling fingers. The screen lit up with a message from the mysterious V. It read, "The prototype is finally ready for the deep dive. Meet me at Pier 19 at midnight tomorrow. Don't tell her. She wouldn't understand the risk." My world tilted on its axis as I read those words. Pier 19 was an abandoned, crumbling industrial dock on the far edge of the city, a place where no legitimate business had been conducted in decades. Who is this Vera, and what deep dive were they preparing for in the dark? The mention of a prototype made it clear that Julian hadn't just invested the money. He was building something physical, something dangerous. I realized then that my husband wasn't just a thief. He was a man spiraling into a delusion that involved black market engineering and midnight rendezvous at the water's edge. The realization that I couldn't handle this alone hit me like a physical blow. If I followed him myself, I'd likely be spotted, and Julian's defensive anger was already reaching a boiling point. I needed a ghost, someone who could see what I couldn't. On Saturday morning, I called Cashin Thorne, a private investigator whose name I had found on a forum for difficult domestic cases involving hidden assets. We met in a crowded park where no one would notice a sobbing woman talking to a man in a nondescript gray coat. "I don't care what it costs," I told him, sliding a small envelope of the little cash I had left across the bench. "I need to know if my husband is a visionary or just a common thief. I need to know what Project Alpha is before it destroys us both." Cashin's voice was like gravel under a boot, low and steady. "Usually, Mrs. Vance, men like this are just liars with expensive hobbies. But if he's at Pier 19, he's either hiding a body or a massive mistake. I'll start the surveillance tonight. Don't change your behavior at home. Act like the supportive wife he expects you to be." 2 days later, the first encrypted file from Cashin arrived in my inbox. My hands shook so violently, I nearly dropped my mouse as I clicked the link. Cashin had successfully tracked Julian's car to a massive, unmarked warehouse in the Oakhaven Industrial District, a maze of rusted steel and salt-cracked concrete. The high-resolution photos showed Julian meeting a woman, tall, sharp-featured, with her hair pulled back in a severe, practical bun. This was Vera. But as I scanned the images, I realized they weren't behaving like lovers. There was no physical contact, no lingering glances. Instead, they were standing under the harsh glare of industrial floodlights, arguing fiercely over a massive piece of machinery that was shrouded in a heavy black tarp. Julian looked manic, his hands flying through the air as he pointed at the machine, while Vera held a clipboard like a shield, her expression one of deep concern. They were in a business partnership fueled by my stolen savings, but it didn't look like a successful one. It looked like a desperate struggle against a ticking clock. I stared at Vera's face, trying to understand what kind of woman would help a man steal from his own family. "She's Vera Kinski," Cashin told me during a secure, whispered call later that afternoon. I ran her background. She's a disgraced naval engineer who was fired from the Defense Department 3 years ago for unorthodox and dangerously unverified theories on submersible propulsion systems. She claims she can build engines that run on a fraction of the power of current models, but no legitimate firm will touch her. Your husband didn't just give her your savings, Elena. He's completely funding a rogue, uncertified lab. My stomach turned over with a sickening lunch. Julian wasn't just cheating in the traditional sense. He was gambling our entire lives and my sister's future on a woman the government had blacklisted for being a safety risk. He had taken our security and poured it into a pipe dream that the experts called a disaster waiting to happen. He thinks he's a pioneer, Cashin added, his voice grim. But based on the shipping manifests I've intercepted, he's buying low-grade carbon fiber and experimental sealants that aren't rated for the pressures he's talking about. He isn't building a legacy. He's building a coffin. The anger I had been suppressing finally boiled over when Julian returned home that night, smelling again of that acrid, burnt metallic scent. I didn't mention the private investigator, but I stood in the kitchen and dropped the name of the warehouse. Oakhaven, Julian? Really? That's where our life savings went. Julian's face went dead white for a split second, then turned a terrifying, mottled shade of red. He slammed his briefcase onto the table so hard a glass rattled. You followed me? You invaded my privacy when I'm on the verge of the greatest breakthrough in marine history. His voice was a roar that vibrated in my chest. My sister's back in the hospital for her preliminary tests, Julian. We needed that money for her deposit today. The doctors are waiting. I screamed back, the tears finally coming. Your sister will be fine, he shouted, stepping into my personal space, his eyes wide and glazed with an unrecognizable fervor. When I sell this patent to the highest bidder next month, she'll have the best doctors in the world and a private wing in the hospital. I am trying to save everyone, and you're just trying to hold me back. Stay out of my work, Elena. I mean it. Cashin called me again on Wednesday morning, and this time, his voice sounded genuinely concerned, stripping away his usual professional detachment. Elena, I looked deeper into the wire transfers and the corporate shell company Julian set up. He didn't just take your $82,000. That was just the beginning, the seed money. I felt the blood drain from my face as I gripped the phone. What do you mean? Anne whispered. He's taken out 3 high-interest private loans from non-traditional lenders, Cashin explained. He's nearly $500,000 in debt now. These aren't bank loans, Elena. These are the kinds of people who don't use lawyers or court dates to collect what they're owed. They use leverage. Physical leverage. I fell into a kitchen chair, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. Julian hadn't just emptied our savings and stolen my sister's hope. He had placed a massive, invisible target on our backs. He was playing a high-stakes game with sharks, using money we didn't have to build a machine that probably wouldn't work. We were standing on a landmine, and Julian was jumping on it, convinced he could fly before it exploded. I couldn't wait for Cashin's reports anymore. The desperation in my chest had reached a fever pitch, and I needed to see the monster my husband had become. I drove to Pier 19 at midnight on Friday, my old car rattling as I navigated the potholed roads of the industrial district. The fog was so thick and yellow it felt like a physical weight, obscuring the hood of my car as I crept toward the water. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the path, the sound of my own footsteps muffled by the damp air. I followed the low, rhythmic humming of a portable generator until I reached the edge of the crumbling dock. There, bobbing in the oily, trash-strewn water of the slip, was a small, sleek, carbon fiber vessel. It looked like a giant, dark needle made of shadows. Julian and Vera were there, their breath visible in the cold, as they struggled to load heavy, pressurized canisters onto the narrow deck. They moved with a frantic, jerky energy, looking over their shoulders every few seconds. Julian looked older, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken, his Project Alpha clearly consuming him from the inside out. I hid behind a stack of rusted, salt-pitted shipping containers, my heart thundering so loudly I was sure they would hear it. The wind shifted, carrying their whispered voices directly to my hiding spot. The pressure seals are only rated for 4,000 meters, Julian, Vera hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The test results from this afternoon were inconsistent. If we go any deeper just to prove the engine works to the buyers, we might not come back up. The hull won't hold. I saw Julian grab her arm, his grip looking painfully tight. We have to do the deep dive tonight, Vera, he replied, his voice sounding manic and distorted. The investors from the Blackwood Group are coming tomorrow morning at dawn. If we don't show them the absolute depth capability and the engine's efficiency at 4,000 plus, we lose every cent. I lose the house. I lose Elena. I lose my entire life. We are going down tonight, or we are staying down forever. He wasn't talking like a scientist. He was talking like a desperate gambler who had put his last chip on a broken wheel. As I watched them from the shadows, a cold realization settled over me like a shroud. He wasn't doing this for a legacy, or for us, or even for my sister's medical bills. Those were just the lies he told to justify his own pathological need to be seen as a titan. He was doing this because he was addicted to the win, to the rush of being the man who proved everyone wrong. He had risked my sister's life, our home, and his own physical safety, not to build a better world, but to stroke his own ego. I watched him step onto that fragile, experimental boat, its movements stiff and uncoordinated. He looked like a man possessed by a demon of his own making. I realized that the man I had married, the man who used to bring me flowers and plan our future over coffee, was gone, replaced by this hollowed-out shell of ambition. He was willing to sink into the blackest depths of the ocean for a chance at a patent, leaving me to deal with the wreckage of the life he was leaving behind on the shore. A hand suddenly touched my shoulder, and I nearly screamed, spinning around to find Cassian Thorne standing in the shadows behind me. I hadn't even heard him approach. "Don't," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the submersible as it began to hum with a deeper, more ominous frequency. I've seen this exact cycle before in my line of work. He's caught in a sunken cost loop. He's already lost so much that he believes the only way to get it back is to double down on a disaster. He'll keep diving until he hits the bottom, one way or another. I looked at the boat, my eyes tearing up from the cold wind. I have to stop him, Cassian. That boat doesn't look like it could survive a swimming pool, let alone the trench. Cassian shook his head slowly, handing me a ruggedized tablet. "It's too late for a conversation, Elena. Look at this. I've spent the last hour hacking into their remote diagnostic feed. The oxygen scrubber is already showing a critical failure in the secondary loop. If they dive to the depths he's talking about tonight, they have less than a 20% chance of ever surfacing again." I stood there in the fog, faced with the most agonizing choice of my life. I had two distinct paths before me, and both felt like a betrayal. I could run out onto that dock right now, reveal that I had been spying on him, and scream until he agreed to stop, potentially saving his life but almost certainly ensuring the money was lost forever and our debt would crush us. Or I could let him go. I could let him face the brutal, physical consequence of his own arrogance and his theft. My hand hovered over my phone, my thumb shaking over the call button for the authorities. I thought of my sister, who was currently lying in a hospital bed waiting for a surgery that might never happen because Julian thought he was a god who could ignore the laws of physics and morality. I thought of the $500,000 in debt to dangerous people that he had signed my name to. Was I obliged to save a man who had already decided I was disposable? The silence of the pier was broken only by the lapping of the dark water against the pilings. Before I could find the courage to move or speak, the heavy carbon fiber hatch of the submersible hissed shut with a finality that sounded like a tomb closing. The Project Alpha vessel slid silently into the black, oily water of the harbor, its navigation lights blinking once before disappearing beneath the surface. The low hum of the experimental engine grew faint, vibrating through the wood of the dock under my feet, and then it disappeared entirely as the boat moved toward the open sea. They were gone. They were heading toward a pressure waves they weren't prepared to handle. I stood on the edge of the pier, the salt air stinging my eyes and the fog clinging to my hair. I felt a strange, terrifyingly cold clarity wash over me. For the first time in weeks, the panic was gone, replaced by a grim sense of purpose. Julian had made his choice to dive into the dark, and now I had to make mine to survive the light. I turned back to Cassian, who was still staring at the tablet with a grim expression. Cassian and I retreated to his nondescript car, sitting in the dark with the heater blowing as we monitored the stolen diagnostic feed. The numbers on the screen were a countdown to a potential disaster. 500 meters. 1,000 meters. 2,000 meters. The descent was far too rapid for an uncertified hull. We sat in total silence, the only sound being the soft intermittent chirping of the tablet as it received data bursts from the surface buoy Julian had deployed. At 3,000 meters, the hull integrity alarm started chirping a low, rhythmic warning. "He's pushing the vertical thrusters too hard," Cassian muttered, his brow furrowed as he analyzed the telemetry. "He's trying to break a depth record he hasn't earned with a craft that isn't even fully cured. The carbon fiber is going to delaminate if he doesn't slow down." I watched the depth gauge climb. 3,200. 3,500. I felt like I was watching a slow-motion car crash, one that I had partially funded with my own stolen future. Every meter deeper was another insult to the life, we had once shared together. When the gauge hit 3,800 meters, the feed suddenly flickered and turned a violent shade of red. A frantic audio clip, distorted by the extreme pressure and the failing communication link, came through the tablet's speakers. It was Julian, but his voice was stripped of all its usual arrogance, replaced by a raw, naked terror. Vera, the primary seal on the starboard side is sparking. We need to vent the battery array now, or we're going to have an electrical fire in a pure oxygen environment. I heard Vera's voice in the background, a high-pitched scream of pure panic. We can't vent. The pressure outside is too high. The valves won't cycle. Julian, we have to drop the weights and surface now. We're dying down here. Julian's response was a manic, guttural shout.
No.
10 more minutes. We need the data for the Blackwood group, or we have nothing. Stay in depth. He was willing to kill them both for a few more lines of data on a spreadsheet. He was willing to turn that submersible into an underwater crematorium just to avoid admitting that he had failed. I didn't call the Coast Guard, and I didn't call the police. I knew that by the time they mobilized, the Alpha would be a crushed soda can at the bottom of the Atlantic. Instead, I pulled out the folder Cashin had given me and dialed a number I had memorized an hour ago. It was the private line for the primary investor of the warehouse, the man Julian was so desperate to impress. Silas Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, I said, my voice coming out like ice-cold steel. Your Project Alpha is currently imploding at nearly 4,000 meters due to an oxygen scrubber failure and an electrical fire. Your husband and wife engineering team is about to become a liability your company can't survive. If you want your multi-million-dollar investment saved and the bad press avoided, you'll send your private recovery team to Pier 19 right now. And you'll deal with me, Elena Vance, because I'm the one holding the diagnostic override codes your genius developer forgot to change. I was bluffing about the codes, but I knew Blackwood couldn't risk the chance that I was telling the truth. Silas Blackwood's private recovery team arrived at the pier in exactly 22 minutes, a blur of high-end black SUVs and professional divers. They were cold, efficient professionals who didn't ask questions. They deployed a high-speed, remote-operated vehicle that looked like a robotic shark, designed to snag the Alpha and drag it back to the surface before the hull gave way. I watched the monitors in their mobile command unit as they hooked my husband's mistake and began the rapid ascent. When the submersible finally breached the surface of the harbor, it looked battered, its sleek finish scorched and peeling. The hatch was pried open with hydraulic tools, and Julian stumbled out onto the dock, vomiting seawater and trembling so violently he couldn't stand. He looked like a broken man, his expensive gear ruined and his pride shattered. He looked up, squinting against the floodlights, and saw me standing there with Silas Blackwood and a private investigator. The silence that followed was heavier than the 4,000 meters of water he had just escaped. Elena? Julian gasped, wiping salt and bile from his mouth as he collapsed onto a pile of rope. What are you doing here? He looked around at the professional team and the cold expression on Silas Blackwood's face. I hired a professional to watch you, Julian, I said, my voice steady and loud enough for everyone to hear. Something you should have done before you started playing scientist with our lives and my sister's medical fund. Silas Blackwood stepped forward, his presence dwarfing Julian's crumpled form. Julian, the basic engineering of the engine is brilliant, I'll give you that. But the man running the project is a dangerous, impulsive idiot. You're out. Effective immediately. I'm buying the patent and the remaining assets from the person who actually holds the legal deed to the equipment in your secret lab. Your wife. Julian looked up, his confusion momentarily overriding his physical trauma. What are you talking about? I signed the lease. I own the lab. Elena has nothing to do with the business side. He looked at me, pleadingly, but I just looked back at him with a cold, dead gaze. Cashin Thorne stepped forward then, pulling a sheet of documents from his coat. Actually, Julian, we've had a very busy 48 hours. When you took those 3 high-interest private loans, you used your home as collateral. But that home is held in a family trust that was established by Elena's parents. The trust explicitly requires Elena's notarized signature for any liens or encumbrances. You forged it, Julian. I have the forensic handwriting report right here, which makes those loans legally void against the property, and the equipment you bought with that money is now seized by the trust as restitution for the $82,000 you table from the savings account. A trust that, as of yesterday, Elena has sole control over. Julian's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, denial, and finally, a crushing realization. He had tried to be a master strategist, but he had forgotten that I knew the fine print of our lives better than he did. He had left a paper trail a mile wide, and I had simply followed it to the end. He was now a man without a project, without a house, and without a wife. Julian didn't go to jail, though the forgery charges could have put him away for a long time. I made him a very specific deal in the back of Blackwood's SUV, while the divers packed up their gear. He signed over every remaining right, every scrap of data, and every intellectual property claim to Project Alpha to me, in exchange for my silence regarding his criminal fraud. He signed the papers with a shaking hand, the ink blurring as a single tear hit the page. I sold the engine patent and the refined data to Silas Blackwood's company for a total of $4.5 million. I paid back the private lenders, who were more than happy to take the cash and disappear, and I cleared every debt Julian had accrued. Most importantly, I paid for my sister's surgery at the most advanced orthopedic clinic in Switzerland, ensuring she would have the best care in the world. And then, once the final wire transfer was confirmed, I had my lawyer serve Julian the divorce papers at the cheap motel where he was staying. Julian tried to call me a dozen times, and when I finally answered, he tried to apologize with a voice that sounded like it had been shredded. He told me he did it for us, that he wanted to surprise me with a life of luxury and ease. No, Julian, I told him, standing in our empty house as the movers took the last of the furniture. You didn't do this for us. You did it for the version of me you wanted to impress, the trophy wife who would marvel at your genius. You never even looked at the real me, the woman who would have worked 2 jobs to support you if you had just been honest. You didn't want a partner. You wanted an audience. He had nothing to say to that. He left town a week later with a single suitcase and a mountain of regret. The man who wanted to be a billionaire, the man who thought he could conquer the ocean, was back to zero, living a life of quiet anonymity in another state. He had reached for the stars by standing on my back, and he had finally fallen. I sit on my new balcony now, overlooking a quiet stretch of coastline where the water is calm and blue. The money is back in the account, and more importantly, my sister is walking again, her recovery a miracle of modern medicine that Julian's arrogance almost tabled. I am a different woman now, sharper, more guarded, and infinitely more aware of the shadows people hide behind their smiles. But the Private Investigator's report still sits in the top drawer of my desk, tucked away, but never forgotten. It serves as a reminder of the night I had to become a predator to survive one. Never trust a man who says, "Trust me," while he's reaching for your wallet, and never let a secret project become a secret life. I watch the waves crash against the shore, knowing that beneath the surface, there are depths that can swallow you whole if you don't have the integrity to stay afloat. I am finally free of the secrets, and for the first time in my life, the future is a horizon I chose for myself.